Once again, the BBC have rounded up a bunch of quote conspiracy theorists to take them on a condescending bus journey. This time to show them their conspiracy theories about the London bombings are incorrect and the official government account is true. This itself, of course, is a logical fallacy. Just because a handful of people who may have watched a couple of speculative internet videos or read some articles are presented as being ill-informed and incapable of arguing their points
personally attack me of big right off camera, no more.
Doesn't therefore mean the government's version is true. It just means they're ill-informed and incapable of arguing their points, or even deliberately edited to look that way. Although probably well-meaning, these four quote conspiracy theorists do not appear to be representative of the vast body of research that proves there are many holes in the official story and many questions to be asked of our government and intelligence agencies. The July 7th Truth Campaign, a literal encyclopedia of 7/7 information, 7/7 researcher and filmmaker Tom Secker, and myself all refuse to go on such shows. Why? Because the BBC are not interested in deeply examining the government's account, the failure of the security services and police, the dubious relationship between Muslim extremists and the government, or the 7/7 inquest, which victim family members themselves admit didn't address all the information.
The security services don't want to have any blame. They don't want to say if they made an apology, it meant that they were guilty of something. And if they're guilty of something, it meant that somebody is to blame. And nobody wants to be blamed. So 7/7 is to be forgotten.
They'd rather just point over there at those silly, outrageous conspiracy theorists because sensationalism draws better ratings and it covers the government's back. Any member of the public who watched 7/7 Conspiracy Road Trip will now believe the government has answered all the questions, and anyone calling for a deeper investigation must be a silly and outrageous conspiracy theorist. So much for their public mandate of educating and informing. Let's go through the main points of the programme, showing the factual errors and red herrings.
Our first stop on our road trip is here in Beeston, a poor area of Leeds and home to three of the bombers. Mohammed Sadiq Khan.
No BBC, that's not Mohammed Sadiq Khan. This is Mohammed Sadiq Khan, at least the way the media and government have portrayed him so far. Why change it now, if not through carelessness?
These four men were hired as patsies. Patsies meaning fall guys, patsies meaning people who were set up to do something. So I think that these men were hired as part of a training drill. They've been hired as actors. These four guys are actually setting out to do what they do. Unbeknown to them, there's a secondary operation running of more precision, which is intent on inflicting parallel. It's parallel.
John agrees with Tony and has more to add to his theory. It's been established there was a mock terrorist exercise going on in London on 7/7 using the same tube stations as the bombers. John thinks this was a government cover-up for the real attack.
One of the major smoking guns for 7/7, for me, has got to be Peter Power's drills that he was running on the morning of 7/7.
At 9:30 this morning, we were actually running an exercise for over a company of 1,000 people in London, based on simultaneous bombs going off precisely at the railway stations that happened this morning.
Peter Power went on to BBC and ITV, and of the afternoon went on to Norwegian television and said this.
Just to get this right, you were actually working today on an exercise that envisioned virtually this scenario?
Almost precisely.
Peter Power's exercise is a classic red herring that has been conflated by careless documentaries like 7/7 Ripple Effect into something it isn't. In 7/7 What Did They Know, I talked with Tom Secker about why the theory that the men were duped onto the trains as part of Power's drill is implausible and doesn't fit the evidence. Power's exercise was not physical with men on the ground like Atlantic Blue. He was simply lecturing in an office with a small number of employees from Reed Elsevier. If Power really was directly involved, why would he plaster himself on TV?
You start out with the bombers, the alleged bombers, were not bombers at all. They were patsies. They weren't in those locations. They weren't on those trains. They weren't on that bus. They did not blow up bombs there. What the ripple effect narrative says is that they were actors of some sort, and they thought that they were playing a role in a terrorism training drill, in the Peter Power terrorism training drill. But aside from the fact that there is no evidence whatsoever connecting these four men to Peter Power, to Visor Consultants, to Reed Elsevier or anyone else involved in this, aside from that sort of absence of positive evidence, we've got some evidence going against it, and that would be the general paranoia of young British Muslim males towards anyone involved in the security services. You know, it's not the easiest thing to go out there and find four young British Muslim men who are willing to play the role of fake terrorists. They'd have to be pretty trusting, and I would also say pretty naive, to agree to do that.
If the theory is that the exercise was running parallel to cover the planning of the real attack, then it didn't do much covering, because it was all over TV. And if it was to disrupt the police or emergency response, it again failed because only a handful of people were involved and were nowhere near the attack. The real question is that if intelligence was available to Power that suggested attacks on the underground were worth preparing for, why weren't they prevented?
We've heard something quite extraordinary, could be a coincidence or not, that your firm on the very day that the bombs went off in London were running an exercise simulating 3 bombs going off in the very same tube stations that they went on. How did this happen? Coincidence, or were you acting on information that you knew?
Attacks had already been planned for, and some of the intelligence is in the public domain.
Davina.
So one of my main concerns in terms of the bombers is where they've come from, so their background.
She can't believe these young men could have been terrorists.
You know, have they done it, you know, because they've been forced to do it? I don't understand enough about these 4 people to be able to conclude that they were capable of doing such a thing.
While the background of the men is a fundamental part of investigating 7/7, the BBC ignore a multitude of intelligence data now in the public domain. Instead, they talk with a local resident of Beeston who said she doesn't think they could have done it because they were nice boys, and then a doctor who specialises in the psychology of terrorists. This is not helpful for either side of the argument. They could have looked at how they may have been radicalised and who exactly linked them to previous extremist behaviour. In 7/7 What Did They Know? I document the government's policy in the 90s of allowing extremists to preach hate. It was a strategy of appeasement called the Covenant of Security. Under the policy, not only were the likes of Abu Hamza and Omar Bakri allowed to call for violent jihad, they both met with the security services several times and were permitted to send young British Muslims to terror training camps overseas to support Blair and Clinton's war in the Balkans. The alleged bombers had at times been followers of these 2 men. Then there's the fact that the authorities surveilled 2 of the alleged bombers 18 months before the attacks. They were photographed, audio recorded, tailed and videotaped on several occasions. And Khan and Tanweer's names, the Iqra bookshop where they volunteered, and a vehicle and phone used by Khan were all on police file, some of this even before the surveillance they officially admit to carrying out. What about Martin McDade, who served in the British Special Boat Service, who preached radical Islam at the Iqra bookshop, who then conveniently disappeared after 7/7? What about Mohammed Qayyum Khan, a suspected MI5 informant who encouraged Sadiq Khan to go to a terror training camp in Pakistan? Or Junaid Babar, an American intelligence informant who set the camp up?
If he was running those training camps with the knowledge of the American Secret Service, it's inconceivable he wasn't passing information of people who were attending those camps to the Americans. So that then begs the question, why didn't the Americans tell the MI5? Or if they did tell MI5, why wasn't something done?
The way British and other countries' intelligence agencies were operating at that time, and how the alleged bombers were linked to those dubious operations through probable secret informants and assets is something far more important to investigate than whether a random lady in Beeston thought they were nice. It is possible that they were duped, but in a vastly more complex way than popular conspiracy theories often promoted by the BBC through programmes like this would have you believe.
John believes the train times were falsified by the government.
They actually made reference to the bombers getting the 7:40 AM train from Luton to King's Cross. 12 months later it came out through various sources, through Freedom of Information Act requests, that that train didn't actually run. The Home Office then had to backpedal, the police backpedaled and said that the bombers got the 7:25. The issue here is that if there is one piece of major glaring information that is wrong in that account, what else in the account is also, you know, fabricated or not true or potentially, you know, wrong.
John makes a good point. The government were careless, like they have been at many other stages of the investigation. However, the train time is really an irrelevant red herring that some people have put far too much weight behind. There is now CCTV footage of the alleged bombers at King's Cross, so sending the group on an exercise to see if they can catch a train at Luton is absurd. Just because they can catch a train doesn't mean the bombers did, but we already know the bombers got to London anyway. And then having the group board the underground carriages certainly isn't proof that the bombers did the same. There is no CCTV of them doing so. Something the government and the BBC have failed to acknowledge about Luton Station was CCTV footage of a mysterious vehicle next to a grassy verge. It's seen shortly after Jermaine Lindsay parks his car. The footage is inexplicably cut for 88 seconds, so we do not see the vehicle arrive. When the three other bombers turn up and park next to Lindsay, the vehicle does a U-turn and approaches them. Once again, the CCTV is cut and a new vehicle is parked next to the bombers. This wouldn't be as significant if it wasn't for the fact that the same vehicle is parked next to the same verge when the alleged bombers were recorded on what has been described as a dummy run a few days earlier. Were the alleged bombers interacting with a fifth man? Were they being surveilled? We don't really know, but it's another aspect of the case that has not been addressed by the authorities.
So far we've proved the bombers could have got there in time, but there is no CCTV evidence after this image in King's Cross train station actually showing them on the tube or the underground platforms.
The police service received no warning about these attacks.
The idea that there was no prior knowledge about the attacks was an early meme repeated throughout the media. But as extensively documented in 7/7 What Did They Know, it has since been acknowledged that there were multiple security and emergency exercises, and even a TV special in the years, months and days leading up to 7/7, preparing for bombings on the underground. These were based on numerous intelligence warnings from other countries that attacks on the transit system were looming, and Saudi Arabia claimed to have warned about a potential attack planned to take place in July 2005. Reports that went right across the international media suggested Israeli intelligence may have known about the attacks sometime in advance, and that Israeli Finance Minister Benjamin Netanyahu may have got a warning to stay in his hotel room in London. 7/7 was something everyone was expecting.
I'm introducing Tony to Brian Paddock, who was the Deputy Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police on the day.
One of the sort of key parts about the 7/7 conspiracy theories was the CCTV footage, or lack thereof. Tony, do you want to?
Yeah, well, my background's security as well, and I used to liaise with the police on CCTV issues. But yet on the actual day of the incident, we find nothing on the underground to place the bombers at the scene of the crime. And I wondered if you could shed any light on it.
I don't know, to be honest with you.
Right.
It could be a whole host of reasons why that footage is missing, other than it wasn't those guys who did it. The system isn't recording properly, one of the cameras is out, the recording medium was full, a whole series of systems that operate that could fail.
At least Brian Paddock is honest. But not only was CCTV not working at the 3 tube stations, nor recovered from the 3 tube carriages, but none filmed Hasib Hussein on the number 30 bus, nor the bus the government claims he rode before switching to the number 30 bus, nor him boarding any of the buses. Even more honest is that Paddock says they don't specifically know why. Did they ever actually ask those who are in charge of it? We're told CCTV is required, but then offered no explanation and nobody is held to account when it fails.
The difficulty with it is, of course, it raises suspicions in people's minds.
Yes.
But the fact is that there is other evidence to place the bombers at the scene in terms of DNA and so forth, and identity documents and that sort of thing.
Although Paddock says this with conviction, there are several important points to make. If they were at the scene of the crime, that doesn't mean they committed the crime. It's public transport. Many people were at the scene. And if we take Mohammed Sadiq Khan and the Edgware road blast as an example, the various official versions contradict each other. The original Home Office narrative says Khan blew himself up near the first double doors of the second carriage. Yet a diagram entered by the Met at the inquest puts the blast more at the centre of the carriage near the second set of double doors. Despite this inconsistency, the bigger problem is that Khan is positioned sitting away from the explosion, with other people closer to it than he was. There's no reports of him throwing his bag into the middle of a crowded train, and the story has always been that they used manual detonation. Furthermore, the diagram used to show where the deceased ended up suggests Khan, rather than being propelled down the carriage by the blast, was somehow dragged several feet round the seating through the explosion and landing next to the second double doors, where passenger Danny Biddle was supposed to be originally standing and since survived.
I've spoken to Danny Biddle, who's the worst injured survivor.
I mean, there are people who say there's no way of proving that even these 4 men blew themselves up.
Well, Danny saw Sadiq Khan reach down and detonate the bomb, so I don't understand why people would say that, that doesn't make any sense.
Biddle is the only person to have claimed to see Khan in the carriage and detonate a bomb, but his account has changed several times over the years, calling it into question. This is not to say Biddle is a liar or part of a conspiracy, but scientific studies show that eyewitness accounts are unreliable, and they're one of the main causes in wrongful convictions of prisoners later exonerated. Biddle was severely injured in the attacks and was in a coma for several weeks. When he came round, he was immediately met with the image of the alleged bombers throughout the media. Can we really put all our faith in his one single testimony? The detail he gave the inquest is not even corroborated by the evidence. Biddle's first account placed Khan even further away than the Met's diagram, sitting next to the first double doors. Later he claimed Khan wasn't sitting, but standing right next to him. Then, at the inquest, he agreed Khan was where the diagram placed him, sitting a few seats to his left. The key part of Biddle's account is his recollection of Khan pulling a cord from a small black rucksack on his lap. But this is considerably different from the large and bulky rucksacks shown on CCTV that morning. The official story is adamant that Khan was a suicide bomber who blew himself up with a manual detonator in his bomb-filled rucksack. But how is this feasible if he was supposed to be sitting somewhere over there with the bomb in his lap, but the blast crater is down here with a hole in the floor, and his body ended up over there? The official version was further rendered useless when Daniel Belston and the driver testified to experiencing a blast hole back at the front of the second carriage, here, and others experienced one nearer carriage 3 all the way over here. How many explosions were there? All of this evidence contradicts itself, and there's certainly nothing that could prove Khan was a suicide bomber. Additionally, Dr. Morgan Costello, the man tasked with certifying the extinction of life, testified at the inquest that the day after 7/7, he certified 6 deaths at Edgware Road and 7 deaths at Aldgate. The only problem with this is that in total, there were 7 deaths at Edgware Road and 8 deaths at Aldgate. He somehow didn't include the alleged bombers or completely missed other people. Further testimony would suggest Sadiq Khan's remains were discovered after everybody else's, along with a fairly unscathed credit card. However, on the day of 7/7, the Metropolitan Police issued 2 premature bulletins citing the number of deceased. At 6:03 they said only 5 deaths had occurred at Edgware Road, 1 less than Costello himself certified a day later. At 6:13 they reported an update saying 7 deaths had occurred, 1 more than Costello certified, but this was long before Khan's remains were allegedly found. Why were the Met reporting deaths before they had been officially certified? And how could they know there was a 7th death if the remains were not yet discovered? Costello told the inquest he was very much led by the crime scene manager, and there was difficulty accessing some of the bodies or even seeing them clearly. Was his job being blocked in some way? These inconsistencies are further compounded by the fact that the process of linking the number of bodies to the names of those considered deceased, how those bodies were recovered, and how they were treated were all deemed outside the scope of the inquest. There were also no internal post-mortems carried out on the bodies. The very purpose of an inquest is to establish who died and how, but even in Britain's largest terrorist attack, this seems too much work for our government. So what remains of Khan are alleged to have been found? Again, this is not clear, but there surely couldn't have been much if nobody noticed them for days. Strangely, the 2 pathologists' examinations do not match, and neither of them match the testimony of the forensic anthropologist. In the span of a few days, it seems Khan gained extra body parts. On the 10th of July, only the lumbar spine and torso area are recorded, but on the 15th, there's all of a sudden a left shoulder, scalp, parts of a skull, parts from the neck region, sternum and skin. The doctor who later reassembled Khan says the body was as intact as this, with only the jaw, fingers, lower pelvis and lower legs completely missing. As the days went on, they also began to discover more and more unscathed cards and documents belonging to Khan from the scene. If he was a suicide bomber, you'd think they'd have burnt up with the explosion. But wait, the BBC has the answer.
According to court testimony, forensics suggest it's likely the driver's license wasn't on the bomber's body when the bomb went off. Like other documents recovered from the wreckage naming the bombers, the license was relatively undamaged. The pattern suggests the bombers dropped them nearby to ensure they would be identified.
Are we to really believe nobody saw Khan throwing credit cards and driving licenses about before taking his seat? Once again, the government's version simply does not add up. Perhaps the most absurd part of the road trip was when they got onto the technical details of the bombs and explosions themselves. The group were taken to see an intelligence and explosives expert who made the extraordinary claim that the bombs on 7/7 contained metal, nuts and bolts within them to cause extra damage.
We knew that from also the fact that there was fragmentation in these devices as well. Basically, you know, bits of metal sellotaped to the or taped to the actual bombs themselves, and those were used to effectively enhance the damage to the individuals on the carriage itself.
That is absolutely shocking, and I'm shocked. I'm shocked to hear that, and I didn't know that. And this is nowhere on any of the conspiracy theories that I've read.
What they do is effectively, if you've just got explosive, you get blast damage, where, you know, as if the blast isn't damaging enough as it is, they actually add nuts and bolts and things. So you get these sort of, you know, critical puncture wounds, effectively.
Nowhere in the official government account, at the inquest, or even in the media has this claim been made before. Nuts and bolts weren't found at the supposed bomb factory, and no nuts and bolts were found at the wreckages linked to the devices. There was one speculative report in the Mirror that a nail bomb was found in one of the vehicles left at Luton, but there's no evidence, and it's never been claimed that this was the kind of device used in the explosions, and the alleged bombers were never forensically linked to any supposed bombs at Luton anyway. This expert was not an expert at any of the scenes. He appears to just be making it up as he goes along. The least the BBC can do is go to experts that have a cursory knowledge of the case.
It's the last day and there's one more conspiracy claim left, and it's another of Tony's.
We've been led to believe that it was homemade bombs that blew up the number 30 bus. But there is reports in the press that military-grade explosive material was found at the scene. I don't think that homemade bombs would be able to cause the damage at the level and weight that were in the rucksacks.
Take a look. 18 Alexandra Grove.
This is the Leeds ex-council flat turned bomb factory that the bombers used as their base. The police found buckets of sand-coloured sludge, boxes of hair dye, and pans full of hydrogen peroxide. But could it have really caused this? We're going to find out.
Tony is on the right track here, but missing some important points which have allowed the BBC to appear like they know what they're talking about. In the days after the attacks, numerous experts did tell the media that they believed explosions of that magnitude could have only been caused by high or possibly military-grade explosives such as C4. But remarkably, no evidence was gathered from any of the blast sites to prove either way. So Tony is incorrect in stating they recovered evidence of military explosives. But the BBC are also incorrect in thinking they recovered evidence for homemade explosives. Much has been made of the supposed bomb factory in Leeds, but forensics gathered no evidence from the blast sites linking the explosions to the pepper and peroxide sludge found in the flat. And although the alleged bombers are forensically linked to items in the flat, none of them are linked to the buckets of sludge. Therefore, the experiment of blowing up a bus has no relevance, because nobody knows what was used in the attacks, and the bombers aren't even directly linked to what they claim might have been used. This didn't stop Andrew Maxwell from proudly lording over his straw man argument.
I can't disprove everything to you, okay? But can you just have some more fucking doubt in these online idiots?
Well, it's nice that Maxwell admits he can't disprove everything. He also hasn't proved anything either. Let's also have some doubt in the broadcasting idiot as well. What should be taken away from this appalling BBC production is that if you have doubts about an event like 7/7, you shouldn't blindly believe the first or most popular conspiracy theory that comes your way, ignoring other possibilities. Just because the government's theory is provably wrong doesn't mean that a self-proclaimed messiah's is right. We can't possibly know exactly what happened that day because of the secretive nature of the security services and the fact that the investigation was utterly incompetent. Claiming to have the smoking gun evidence or the perfect closed case theory of an inside job not only strawmans independent researchers, but also puts you at odds with victim family members who themselves are actually still looking for answers.
When you read into it and you get to see as much as I and many others have, there is an anger at being let down.
Yeah.
In the build-up to the attacks, we'd heard that the security services had been noting Sadiq Khan for a number of years, but at the inquest we found out they'd actually been training him since the year 2000.
What we should also take away from this is that the BBC are utterly incompetent themselves and in no way an authority on the subject. Instead of doing their jobs as investigative reporters, they fiercely defend the government's inaccurate version and then prop up the straw man of quote conspiracy theorists so they can knock them down and improve the government's image. The real investigation continues.